He was just an old man in a dusty truck, parked wrong, blocking 2 spots in the sweltering heat outside a grocery store. Annoyed customers muttered. A teenage employee was sent to ask him to move. But when the boy approached, he saw something on the dashboard that stopped him cold. A faded photograph and a medal, the Distinguished Service Cross. What happened next silenced the entire parking lot and turned frustration into reverence. This isn't just a story about parking, it's about what we fail to see, until it's almost too late. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss the next one. The asphalt shimmered in the heat, waves of distortion rippling above the blacktop like ghost steam. Engines idled. A horn blared. Somewhere a baby cried. It was the kind of July afternoon in Georgia that made tempers short and sweat stubborn. The parking lot outside Priceway Market was jammed tighter than usual. Backed up cars, carts bumping fenders, folks weaving through the chaos with their shirts sticking to their backs. And there, near the front entrance, sat a dusty old Ford pickup, faded blue and parked diagonally across 2 prime spots like it didn't care who noticed. People noticed. A minivan slowed behind it, blinker ticking in annoyance. The driver threw up her hands and rolled on. A man with 2 toddlers muttered a curse as he maneuvered around, shaking his head. One by one, the irritation bloomed. Not rage, just that quiet, collective grievance that builds when you feel someone's making things harder than they need to be. Inside the store, Dana, the assistant manager barely out of high school, sighed as another customer complained about the truck guy. She nodded, turned, and looked toward Mason, the summer bag boy folding paper sacks near the registers. "Can you go ask him to move his truck?" she asked, half apologetic. Mason wiped his hands on his apron and nodded. He wasn't one for confrontation, but it didn't seem like a big deal. Just an old man, probably confused. Happens. The pickup's windows were rolled halfway down. The man inside sat still, both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead like the chaos of the lot didn't touch him. He didn't blink, didn't fidget, just sat there like he was listening to something far away. Mason tapped the window gently. The old man turned slowly, his face a map of deep lines and sun-worn skin. His eyes were pale and distant but alert, like he'd just come back from somewhere long ago. Mason smiled politely. "Hey, sir. Sorry, I think you're in 2 spots. We just need you to shift a little so folks can get by." The man looked at Mason for a long moment. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said quietly. But he didn't move. Not yet. Mason shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing back at the sliding doors of the grocery store like they might suck him back inside and spare him the awkwardness. He wasn't the confrontational type, more comfortable packing melons and paper towels than calling out parking violations. But Dana had asked, and she was technically his boss, even if she still called him dude half the time. The heat baked through the soles of his shoes as he approached the old pickup, its paint long surrendered to sun and time. Dust clung to the windshield in a fine, even coat, save for 2 clean arcs where the wipers had recently swept. The windows were half down, letting the heavy air move in and out like breath. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, not wanting to startle the man. "Sir," he said, voice cautious but kind. The old man turned slowly, as if he already knew someone was there. His face was stone, not unfriendly but worn in the way mountains are worn, shaped by years of weather and war. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, and his hands rested on the wheel like they'd always known what to do with one. After a pause, he rolled the window the rest of the way down with a soft creak. "Yes, son," he said. His voice was low, the kind that didn't need to rise to be heard. Mason cleared his throat. Just wanted to let you know you're parked over the line a little. Folks are having trouble getting around. If you could maybe just scoot over a bit." The man nodded once. Of course. But he didn't move, just stayed there, still and quiet. Mason was about to thank him and walk away when he saw it. Something catching the light on the dashboard. Not junk, not keys or sunglasses or receipts. It was framed, small and square, like it had been placed there with care. A medal, tarnished but unmistakable, gold and bronze with a purple ribbon faded by the sun. It sat next to a black and white photograph of a younger version of the man in uniform, standing straight-backed and solemn, flanked by men whose names were likely long gone to anyone but him. Mason blinked, suddenly unsure of his next words. I didn't mean to be rude," he said quickly. The old man didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "You weren't," he said. And still, he didn't move. Mason leaned in a little, the sun warming his neck as he studied the small frame on the dash. The metal inside wasn't flashy. No oversized ribbon or bright enamel. It was dignified, gold cross, laurel wreath, a subdued ribbon of blue and red. He didn't know what it was exactly, but something about it made him pause. It didn't look like something you bought or showed off. It looked like something earned, maybe carried around quietly for years before being set there like a piece of home. The photo beside it showed the same man, decades younger. The uniform was crisp, collar squared, jaw clean-shaven, eyes just as steady. He stood shoulder to shoulder with others in a grainy black-and-white shot, their expressions caught somewhere between pride and exhaustion. Mason hesitated, unsure if he was crossing a line, but curiosity got the better of him. "Sir," he asked softly, "what's that medal for?" The old man didn't answer right away. His fingers shifted slightly on the wheel, his thumb tracing the edge like he'd done it 1,000 times. "It's called the Distinguished Service Cross," he said at last, voice even. "Second highest you can get." Mason blinked. He didn't know much about military stuff, but that sounded serious. "Wow," he said, more breath than word. What did you do to get that?" The old man looked at him then, just for a second. Not harshly, not proudly either. Just a kind of quiet weight behind the gaze. "A long time ago," he said, "in a place not many remember anymore." There was no story that followed, no names, no battles, just that one sentence spoken like a sealed box. And somehow Mason understood that was all he was going to get, and all he needed. The heat of the afternoon buzzed around them, cicadas droning from somewhere in the trees. Behind Mason, the world kept turning, grocery carts rattling, kids yelling, car doors slamming. But out here in the heat beside this old truck, time had slowed down. And in that silence, Mason realized something. He hadn't asked a stranger to move his truck. He'd stumbled into history. Eddie Malone didn't intend to share much. Men like him rarely did. But sometimes in the right light, with the right question and the right kind of silence, a few pieces slipped through. Mason hadn't moved yet. He stood beside the truck door, his hands folded in front of him, not pushing, not prying, just listening. "Name's Eddie," the old man said quietly, eyes still on the horizon. "Edward Malone, but everyone just called me Eddie back then." Mason nodded. "Nice to meet you, sir." A pause stretched between them, soft and uncertain. Then Eddie spoke again, slower this time, like the words had to make their way up from deep inside. "I was in Korea, 50 to 53, joined at 17. Said I was 18, but nobody checked too hard in those days." He let out the smallest chuckle, dry and without amusement. Seemed like everyone had a reason to leave home back then. Mason didn't say anything, just shifted his weight and leaned against the warm metal of the truck bed. Eddie's gaze drifted toward the framed metal on the dash. Was a fire team leader, 1st Marine Division, Chosin Reservoir. He paused, his jaw tightening. That winter damn near killed us all. 30 below, maybe colder with the wind. Frostbite took fingers off boys before the bullets ever had a chance. Mason swallowed, suddenly unsure what to say. We got pinned in a valley. Chinese came down from the hills, more than we could count. My men, Eddie stopped, then shook his head. We held as long as we could. I led the last of them through a frozen creek under moonlight. Just 5 of us made it. Started with 12. He didn't cry. His voice didn't crack. But Mason could hear it. The weight of names never spoken again. The kind of memory that never softened with time. I still hear their voices, Eddie said. Not every night, but some, usually when the wind sounds like boots crunching snow. Another silence settled. And Mason, 17, born half a century after that war, knew in that moment he wasn't just talking to an old man in a truck. He was talking to a survivor, a keeper of ghosts, a quiet hero who carried the past like a scar beneath his shirt. The world didn't stop, but it did slow down. The usual Saturday chaos outside the grocery store began to shift, like someone had turned the volume down without warning. Conversations hushed. Shopping carts rolled more quietly. People glanced over, curious at first, then hesitant, then still. It wasn't what Eddie said that drew them in. It was how he said it. Calm, straightforward. No dramatics, no sentimentality. Just facts, laid down like tools on a bench. One by one, a few employees wandered out. First the cart kid, then the cashier on break, then Dana from customer service who'd sent Mason out in the first place. Customers followed. Most didn't even realize why they'd paused. They just saw a young man standing next to an old truck, listening like it mattered. And somehow that mattered to them too. Eddie kept talking in that same even tone. Told them about the cold, how rifles jammed with ice, how blood froze before it hit the snow. Told them about digging into frozen ground with bare hands because there weren't enough entrenching tools to go around. He mentioned names. Rodriguez, Harper, Little Jimmy, a list only he remembered now. No anger in his voice. No pride either. Just remembrance. I used to think if I kept saying their names, maybe they'd last a little longer, Eddie said quietly. But time forgets most things, son. You learn to live with that. Nobody told him to move anymore. The complaints had vanished. The 2 parking spots his truck occupied might as well have been a memorial now. Mason watched him closely. At first he'd seen just a weathered old man in a beat-up Ford. But now he saw something deeper. The way Eddie's fingers occasionally clenched the steering wheel, like it grounded him. The way his voice never trembled, but his eyes flicked just slightly when he mentioned certain memories. There was strength there, sure, but also loss, a kind that wasn't written down anywhere, a kind that had lived in silence for too long. No one said the word hero. Eddie wouldn't have liked that. He wasn't telling a story to be thanked. He was just answering a question the only way he knew how, with the truth. And in that parking lot, under a sky heavy with summer heat and old ghosts, the people who once saw an inconvenience now saw a man. From the edge of the gathering, a soft voice broke through. Did you say Chosin? Heads turned as a woman in a wide-brimmed straw hat stepped forward, her cane tapping gently on the pavement. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, but there was a straightness in her back that time hadn't bent. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she wore a simple blouse with a faded American Legion pin fastened near the collar. Eddie turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing just a bit. Not suspicious, just searching. The woman stepped closer, peering past Mason to get a better look at the man in the pickup. "You were at the reservoir?" she asked. Eddie nodded once. "1st Marine Division." "I was with the 85th MASH," she said. "Seoul, then Hagaruri. Coldest winter I ever saw." A moment passed between them, quiet and immediate, like two old radio signals finally crossing paths after decades of static. "What's your name, son?" she asked. "Malone," Eddie replied. "Sergeant Edward Malone." The woman blinked, her lips parting just slightly. "I knew it," she whispered. "You were the one in that report." Sergeant Malone carried 2 men across a frozen draw under fire. One had a shattered leg, the other was unconscious. "They said you refused evacuation until every man in your squad was accounted for." Eddie looked down, uncomfortable. "Lot of us did things like that. But not all of us survived it," she said, her voice firmer now. "Not all of us kept showing up." Murmurs spread through the little crowd. People who had just moments ago been fanning themselves and checking their watches now stood still. Their faces changed. They weren't looking at an old man in a dusty truck anymore. They were looking at something living and rare, a chapter of history with a heartbeat. Someone who had been etched into old reports, spoken of in footnotes, and now, unexpectedly, sat among them like a relic that still breathed. Mason turned to Eddie, his throat tight. "You never told me that part," he said. Eddie offered the faintest smile, eyes soft beneath the lines. "Didn't think it mattered." But in that moment, surrounded by strangers who now stood in reverent silence, it mattered more than he could know. The rhythm of the parking lot changed, not all at once, but like a tide turning slow and deliberate. The honks stopped. The shuffle of carts quieted. People who had once passed by Eddie Malone's old pickup without a glance now lingered. They stood not just to listen, but to see, really see him. A man in a ball cap and Army Ranger t-shirt stepped forward, his gait stiff from old injuries. He stuck out his hand with the kind of reverence you don't fake. "Desert Storm," he said. "I was in the 3rd Armored. It's an honor, Sergeant." Eddie shook his hand, nodding once. "Thank you for yours, son." Another woman stepped forward, her toddler balanced on one hip and a bag of groceries in the other. Her voice cracked just slightly when she spoke. "My boy's in the Corps," she said. "Deploys next spring. Just thank you for paving the way." Eddie didn't respond with speeches. Just a gentle, weathered smile and a tip of the head. That was enough. A little girl, no older than 6, stepped close and tugged on the hem of his rolled-up sleeve. Her eyes were wide, curious. "Were you scared?" she asked. Eddie looked at her, the softness in his gaze sharper than any metal. He bent just slightly so she could hear him clear. "Every minute," he said, "but we did it anyway." That answer hung in the air, honest and weighty, more powerful than any flag-waving commercial ever could be. It was the kind of truth only someone who'd been there could say out loud without flinching. Dana, the assistant manager, came back out with 2 store clerks. They didn't say much, just started moving the orange cones and a weathered "no parking" sign near Eddie's truck. One clerk knelt and drew fresh chalk lines around the space. The other set up a folding chair in the shade nearby. "He's fine right there," Dana said. Her voice hushed, like they were in a chapel now. And it felt that way. Sacred in the simplest of forms. An old man in a worn truck, parked beneath the summer sun. Not in the way, not anymore. right where he belonged. The screen door of the market swung open with a soft squeak, and the store manager stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag like he'd just remembered he was part of something unfolding outside his aisles and inventory sheets. He was a man used to handling complaints and delivery trucks, not moments like this. His pace was slow, respectful. He took off his cap as he approached Eddie's truck. "Sir," he began, eyes steady but voice unsure, "I want to apologize. Earlier, asking you to move, I didn't realize." Eddie looked up, still seated behind the wheel like the dash was part of his body now. "No apology needed," he said gently. "You were just doing your job." The manager nodded, but didn't quite relax. "Still, we should have seen you." A few feet away, Mason returned from inside, a bottle of cold water in his hand, condensation dripping down the label. He held it out carefully, like it was something sacred. Eddie took it with a nod, twisting the cap open with fingers that still worked like they remembered how to do things under pressure. "I didn't know," Mason said, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "That's all right," Eddie replied, taking a small sip. "Most people don't." It wasn't said with bitterness, just a truth, worn down to its simplest shape. That small exchange, barely more than a whisper between generations, sent a ripple through the crowd. A woman in the back pulled out her phone, not to live stream or chase likes, but to capture something her grandchildren could see one day. A man beside her followed suit, hands trembling slightly as he held the camera still. They weren't filming a spectacle. They were recording remembrance. No one posed. No one directed. They just let it be what it was, a moment that should have happened sooner, and somehow was happening now. For so long, Eddie had been another face in the background, another old man in a grocery lot. But today something shifted. He hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't raised his voice or demanded a second of anyone's time. He had simply shown up, and at last the world around him was beginning to do the same. By the time the sun began its slow descent behind the Priceway Market, casting long golden streaks across the pavement and lighting the old pickup in a soft amber glow, a single photo had made its way across town. Eddie Malone, sitting behind the wheel of his truck, the metal catching the sunlight just right, his expression calm, unbothered, and unknowingly iconic. The picture had been taken by a teenager with no following, no agenda, just a sense that something important was happening. The caption was simple. They asked him to move, then saw who he really was. It wasn't a plea for likes or a call to go viral. It was a quiet reflection, the kind that doesn't need capital letters or hashtags to resonate. People in town started sharing it. A retired teacher recognized Eddie from a church bulletin years ago. A local veterans group reposted it with a single word, respect. Then a city council member shared it. Then a news station. By nightfall, it had found its way to national feeds, wedged between headlines about politics and sports scores. But this story didn't shout, it didn't break news. It reminded people. Comments trickled in first, then flooded. "My grandfather served in Korea, never talked about it." "We need more stories like this. Thank you, Eddie, whoever you are." No one tagged Eddie. No one knew his handle. He didn't have one. There was no TikTok, no interviews, no video. Just that one still image. A dusty old man in a dusty old truck with a lifetime on his dashboard. The story didn't trend. It lingered. It slipped into inboxes and family group chats. It sparked dinner table conversations and long overdue phone calls to aging parents. And in homes across the country, people began to look a little longer at the older man walking through the produce aisle, or the woman with the military pin faded by decades. They looked closer. Because sometimes heroes don't wear name tags. They don't announce themselves. They just park quietly, weather the heat, and wait for someone to notice. And when someone finally does, the rest of us are better for it. A week later, before the Sunday rush, 2 maintenance workers arrived in a quiet corner of the Priceway parking lot. They didn't wear suits. They didn't bring a crowd. Just a post hole digger, a new sign, and a story they'd each read 3 times over. They took their time, measured twice, poured the concrete slow and even. When they were done, they stepped back and looked at what they'd made. Reserved for veterans, in honor of Edward Malone. The paint was fresh. The letters, bold but simple. No spotlight, no ribbon cutting, just a gesture carved into pavement, as permanent as the town could offer. At 9:17 a.m., the old blue Ford pulled in. The same low rumble, the same dust on the fenders. Eddie eased the truck into place like it belonged there, because now it did. He didn't say anything when he saw the sign, just looked at it for a long moment, then turned the key, shut off the engine, and sat still. Maybe he was remembering. Maybe he was just breathing it in. Either way, no words were needed. Mason showed up around 10, out of uniform this time. Just jeans and a t-shirt, a notebook in his back pocket, unsure why he'd brought it. He didn't work Sundays anymore, but he came anyway, not to shop, just to sit. Later that day, they'd be side by side on Eddie's porch. The screen door would creak the same way it always did, and the wooden chairs would groan under the weight of 2 very different kinds of youth. Mason would sip lemonade while Eddie talked, not about combat or decorations or headlines, but about the men he served with. About how Rodriguez used to hum while cleaning his rifle, how little Jimmy once mailed a snowball home in a coffee tin, how duty wasn't a word you said, it was something you carried, day after day, even when no one noticed. Eddie never called himself a hero, never spoke like a man who had been etched into history. He just talked like someone who'd lived a life with his boots on and his heart steady. Because some legacies don't shout. They sit quietly, waiting to be seen.